When you hear the name Sitting Bull, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably a legendary warrior, right? Well, that's true, but behind that icon was an absolutely brilliant political strategist. Today, we're going to dig into the core philosophy that guided his every move, a philosophy that would unite a nation and challenge one of the most powerful governments on Earth.
So yeah, we have all these titles for him: warrior, war chief, leader of the Lakota, but you know what? Those labels, they barely even scratch the surface of his political mind and the incredible, consistent vision he had for his people.
So, if we really want to understand the man, we've got to look past the battlefield and get inside his head. What was it? What was this political philosophy that drove him to unite a nation against what seemed like impossible odds?
Okay, so to get the leader, you first have to get the man. And his entire worldview, well, it was forged from the very beginning by the values of his Lakota culture.
You might find this surprising, but his childhood nickname wasn't exactly a compliment. They called him Slow. Why? Because he was just so deliberate, so calculated in everything he did. But that same careful, methodical nature, that would become the absolute bedrock of his strategic genius as a leader.
His whole life was guided by these four cardinal virtues of Lakota society: bravery, wisdom, fortitude, and generosity. Now, for Sitting Bull, these weren't just some abstract ideas you talk about. Nope, they were a practical code of conduct, a political framework for how a leader must act.
And check this out, at just 14 years old, his very first act of war perfectly captured this philosophy. He didn't kill an enemy, he counted coup. He actually touched a Crow warrior in battle and got away unharmed. This was the ultimate display of bravery, right? It was about prioritizing honor and psychological victory over simple bloodshed. You see, his path to leadership was never about personal power. It was rooted in community service. By joining the elite Strong Heart Society, he took a lifelong oath to protect his people, especially the most vulnerable among them. And this principle, this idea of selfless defense, would define his entire political career. It wasn't long before these values were put to the ultimate test. As he started encountering the United States, his philosophy of community defense, it hardened into a firm political stance: defiance.
This quote right here, this perfectly captures his foundational political belief. It wasn't coming from a place of hate. It came from a deep, profound conviction in the superiority and the sovereignty of the Lakota way of life. He just saw no reason to change, to compromise, or to surrender what his people already had.
Now, his defiance wasn't based on ignorance or stubbornness. It was based on direct observation. First, he watched the U.S. break its treaties with the Dakota. Then, he personally experienced the Army's indiscriminate retaliation against his own people who had nothing to do with it. So when the 1868 treaty came along, his refusal to sign was a calculated political move, born from a very well-earned distrust of American promises. And what do you know, just 6 years later, his distrust was completely, totally vindicated. The treaty that promised the sacred Black Hills to the Lakota forever was pretty much torn up the second gold was discovered. For Sitting Bull, this was the final proof. Negotiation was a trap, and the only logical political path forward was resistance. And this was the final move that turned his political philosophy into an actual plan of action. He was faced with an impossible deadline, in the middle of winter no less, to surrender his people's entire way of life or be attacked. So Sitting Bull chose a third option. He took his political defiance and transformed it into a grand strategy. He basically weaponized the idea of unity itself to create an incredibly powerful coalition. So his reaction to this ultimatum was a truly profound political act. He created what he called a unity camp, and he invited all the non-treaty bands, anyone who refused to submit, to join him. I mean, he wasn't just gathering an army, he was assembling a sovereign nation on the move.
And the response? It was overwhelming. We're talking an estimated 10,000 people. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho bands, they all joined him. This wasn't just some camp. It was a mobile capital city. It was a massive political statement of solidarity and a direct challenge to U.S. authority.
His spiritual leadership now became his most effective political tool. Right before the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he performed the grueling Sundance ritual, and he received a vision of soldiers just falling from the sky right into his camp. This prophecy spread like wildfire and electrified the thousands gathered there, unifying them with the shared sense of destiny that led directly to one of the most famous victories in American history.
But even after a triumph like that,
The war of attrition just kept going. And the final chapter of his life, which a lot of people see as a defeat, was actually the ultimate test of his political philosophy. See, after fleeing to Canada, the buffalo herds started to disappear, and his people were starving. His decision to come back and surrender was not an abandonment of his principles. It was a continuation of them. It was a leader's pragmatic choice to make sure his community survived.
As he returned, he handed over his rifle, and he made this incredibly powerful statement. This was not a confession of defeat. No way. This was a political declaration for the history books, a final, defiant message that his spirit of resistance was, and always would be, unbroken.
And even without a weapon, his political battle raged on. He refused to give up his 2 wives, he rejected converting to Christianity, and he became the leading voice against government agents who were trying to break up the reservation and sell off Lakota land.
In the end, it was his political influence, not a weapon, that the government feared the most. Now, he was actually pretty skeptical of the Ghost Dance movement, but they knew his support could ignite another rebellion. His arrest and his tragic death, they were the government's final admission that right up to the very end, Sitting Bull remained the most potent political force among his people.
Which, it leaves us with this final thought. Sitting Bull's life really forces us to reconsider what victory even means. When you're faced with impossible odds, maybe the greatest political triumph isn't about winning the war. Maybe it's about maintaining your principles and ensuring that your spirit and the spirit of your people is never truly conquered.